Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Maryland Risk Management Education Podcast. My name is Paul Geringer, and I'm the Extension Legal Specialist here in the Department of Ag and Resource Economics at the University of Maryland. And sorry for the slight delay in some of these episodes when we get into extension meeting season time of year. It's always hard to kind of get some of these out quickly and have time to edit them with everything else going on. So hopefully as those are winding down, there will be more time to do stuff like this and make sure keep the podcast up because there's still, a lot of interviews I want to bring folks over the next year. So hopefully we're back and should be back at a twice a month pace as we've been in the past. But yes, thank you for bearing with me as we got through that season. Today, we want to talk a little bit about the final hemp rule that USDA through the Ag Marketing Service has published and talk a little bit about what's in it, what's different from the previous rule or the interim final rule, and just kind of give a little bit of sense of what we can expect as we move forward with this and kind of what's the status of it as we've had a change in administration since it came out. So to set the stage with a little bit of this, on January 15th of this year, 2021, USDA's Ag Marketing Service published the final hemp rule for the domestic hemp production program. The final rule will make changes related to sampling for testing, including expanding the days before harvest when the sampling can take place and testing, how testing should take place, testing needing to be done by a DEA enforced lab or registered lab will be delayed until the end of 2022. Changes to what will be considered a negligent violation are included. Changes to the requirements related to the destruction of a hot crop or that crop testing over 0.3% THC, and allowances for how you can remediate that crop once it tests hot. So we'll talk all about this. So as we get started now thinking about this, what has not changed? So in 2019, AMS published the interim final hemp rule to begin implementing the domestic hemp production program under the 2018 Farm Bill. Looking at the final rule, several things remain consistent with the interim final rule. The final rule leaves the requirements to measure total THC, which is a measurement of both THC and THCA. So that stays the same. That's in the Farm Bill. That has to be changed through legislation. The acceptable level of THC will remain at 0.3%. Comments have pointed out that allowing up to 1% of THC would be safe, but such a requirement would require congressional action. In the last Congress, the one that ended on basically January 2nd, of this year, Senator Rand Paul from Kentucky introduced legislation that would increase the THC levels to 1%, but nothing happened. It was about in December he introduced that, and there was enough time to move it forward. At this point, as of the recording of this podcast, that has not been reintroduced into the new Congress. We'll have to wait and see what happens there. But my guess is there may be some movement there down the road. What are the final rule changes? Well, the final rule does make changes for what the sampling window would be before harvest. So in the interim final rule, it was 15 days. In the new final rule, it's 30 days. Commenters had pointed out the confusion that the 15-day window would create and the issues it would cause growers. AMS agreed to provide additional flexibility by allowing the extra 15 days before harvest to test a crop. So that is something we will see implemented in the final rule. AMS is changing where samples must be collected from approximately 5 to 8 inches in length from the main stem, the terminal bud, or the central cola. AMS moved away from the interim final rules requirements to take samples from the top 1/3 of the plant. So we are seeing, some need to provide some consistency for how this crop should be tested, which is one of the comments that came through in that. AMS will also allow states and tribal governments to develop a performance-based method of testing to allow for more flexibility. The performance-based method must ensure a confidence level of 95% that the hemp will not test beyond the 0.3% THC threshold level. States or tribal governments can use the performance-based method with a seed certification program or process identifying varieties with consistently compliant hemp plants in the state or the tribal territory. The performance-based method will also be acceptable for hemp grown for research purposes and a producer who has consistently produced compliant hemp over a long period of time. My guess is this is going to take some time for states to develop, and we'll have to see how AMS goes about allowing states to implement this. The interim final rule required samples to be tested in a DEA registered laboratory to determine the THC level. AMS suspended this requirement for the 2020 growing season. There were not enough DEA registered labs in the country to be able to handle this. The final rule will not require samples to be tested in a DEA registered laboratory until December 31st, 2022. As of January 2021, there were only 44 DEA registered laboratories in 22 different states. This delay in requiring a DEA registered lab is intended to allow more laboratories to get registered and ease growers' concerns about potential delays. The biggest change is, what is going to be considered a negligent violation. That's going to increase under the final rule. Under the interim final rule, a crop testing at a 0.5% or higher would be considered a negligent violation, and that is 0.5% or higher of THC. The final rule will increase this to 1% THC, as long as a grower uses reasonable farming practices but grows hemp testing over 0.3%, but below 1%, it's not a negligent violation unless we get a THC concentration well over 1%. So, what happens next? Well, a grower with 3 negligent violations in a 5-year period will be ineligible from growing hemp starting with the 3rd negligent violation date. So if your 3rd negligent violation in 5 years is in 2024, you will have to wait 5 years from that date to be able to grow hemp again. And if a grower has multiple fields testing above 1%, there will only be 1 negligent violation in the year. You can only have 1 negligent violation. So all fields will count under, as 1 negligent violation and not multiple negligent violations. The final rule is less strict about destroying a crop over 0.3% THC. Under the interim final rule, the destruction of basically what is now considered marijuana was required to be done by DEA or an authorized entity. Typically, local or state law enforcement agencies or other groups would have been considered this. Under the interim or under the final rule, growers will now be able to use a list of approved methods to destroy the hemp. I'm going to include a link to a post where I've written this up, but the link is in there as well. And you can get to this. Most of it is working it under, burning it, using it as mulch, doing other stuff that will get rid of it and not require you to go through a DEA or another authorized entity. There were some concerns by doing that. Would the farmer have to pay for the destruction? This way we keep costs reasonable. And as long as you're using one of the AMS approved methods, you should be fine. The final thing the interim final rule does, not the interim final rule, I keep saying that because I'm so used to saying the interim final rule. The final thing that the final rule does is it provides this opportunity to remediate a hemp crop testing over 0.3% to make the crop compliant. Remediation under the final rule can be accomplished by removing or destroying flower material while retaining stalk, stem, leaf material, and seeds. Remediation can also be done by shredding the entire plant into a biomass-like material, then retesting the shredded biomass for compliance. AMS agreed with commenters on the interim final rule for the need that some form of remediation be allowed. Remediation guidelines are also available through AMS and how you would go about doing that. So the final rule it's delayed currently. It's one that came out during the final days of the Trump administration. It's currently under review by the new Biden administration. It will potentially go in effect, probably later this year if we don't see any change, but we may see changes going into effect. At the same time, we're going to have to see states probably look at amending, what their final plans look like with USDA to make sure that their plans, the state plans that the Farm Bill requires, are in compliance and allow for some of the greater flexibility that the final rule now allows for. So, this will be an ongoing process that we'll probably see some development on over the next few months. So, pay attention to either this podcast or my blog, and we'll have more information up there for you as well. As well as I'd like to think this work is all done through support through a grant, and I will have all that information in the show notes as well. So, I can acknowledge my funders. So thank you again for listening. If you have any thoughts on future episodes that I should cover, please let me know at lgoering@umd.edu, or you can tweet me or send me a message on Instagram at aglawpaul. Thank you again for listening and enjoy the rest of your day.